Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 16, Section 1, The United States Enters World War I. And we've talked a little bit about World War I last year in world history. We were talking primarily from a European point of view, but this time around we're going to focus a little bit more on what was happening with the United States and our involvement in that war to end all wars. So we're going to start by going back and reviewing something from maybe your world history class. And I want to talk about the main reasons why World War I began. And you need to remember this acronym. M is for militarism, this whole idea that many of our European nations were in an arms race. They were building up weapons to outdo the other nation. Germany and Great Britain being probably the two biggest nations that were really in this arms race. The second item is alliances. Really, since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there had been a system of alliances that had basically sustained Europe. And occasionally that meant that certain nations would be constantly going to war, particularly what would be Prussia or eventually Germany and the French. Imperialism, this goal of trying to establish colonies throughout the world, this made our European nations incredibly competitive. And if you won a war, one of the bonuses might be that you would gain certain colonies from your opponent. And then finally, nationalism, this extreme pride in your country or your nation. All of these items fed the fuel for this First World War. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the who, what, where, when, why. And number one, what nation became bitter enemies of France in the 1870s? And that would be Germany. Really, the whole idea of the birth of Germany comes out of the Prussian Empire. And we had many what we would call Germanic states. These states would eventually unite and form what is now known as the nation of Germany. And really through the 1870s onward, there's always going to be some kind of war that's going to go between the French and the Germans. And number two, why did alliances between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary alarm the Russian leaders? Okay, and many of these leaders, for the most part, feared that Germany had intended to expand eastward into Russia. And probably so. I mean, the Russians were looking, obviously, to establish colonies elsewhere, and the Germans were doing the same thing. And obviously, they were kind of competitive with one another. The part of Russia that's kind of on the western edge is very good farmland. And I'm sure that the Germans were kind of looking at that thinking, boy, that would be a real bonus if we could acquire that. And number three, how did the alliance system encourage militarism? And part of this was because we had an arms race. And it was primarily between the British and the Germans. The British had the biggest navy and the Germans had the biggest army. And for the most part, they were trying to outdo one another. The British wanted to have a better army, and the Germans obviously wanted to have a better navy. And that just led to spending more money and building more weapons. And number four, what is the main idea behind self-determination? And self-determination is basically when people who share a certain national identity have the ability to go and form their own country. In a way, this was like what happened to the Germans. We had a whole bunch of different Germanic states. They united in the 1870s to form the nation of Germany. But in other parts of the world, there were also kind of these individuals who were wanting to form their own countries. And this might have led to the downsizing of some of our larger nations. So, for example, Austria-Hungary had expanded their territory into some Slavic lands. And some of these Slavic people wanted their own, nation. They wanted to be able to choose for themselves. And in a way, this kind of leads us to a crisis in the Balkans. The Balkans is a peninsula where today we would find the country of present-day Greece, and what used to be Yugoslavia, but would become the nations of Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia and so forth. So how were both imperialism and nationalism involved in the Balkan crisis? And part of this was the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled over the Balkans. And national groups within these empires began pushing for independence. So you're going to hear a little bit about, Serbians and a group known as the Black Hands trying to, kind of push the Austrian Hungarians out. So why did Russia support the Serbian nationalist group that assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia, you see pictured there below, just minutes before they were assassinated. The assassin was a guy named Gavrilo Princip, who you see pictured there, and the organization that he belonged to was known as the Black Hand. Okay, the Russians belong to a similar ethnic group as the Slavs, or the Serbians in this case, and supported their independence from Austria-Hungary. And so when Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand, who was the Archduke, who one day probably would have been the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, what the Russians basically handed down was an ultimatum that at some point in time that the people that were the Serbians would be given an opportunity to have their own nation. At the same time, the Austro-Hungarians wanted to have vindication for this assassination. And so what we end up having is the initial outbreak of World War I. So who were the initial countries involved? And to begin with, we have Austria, who would be on the side of the Central Powers, Serbia, who would be with the Allies, Russia with the Allies, Germany with the Central Powers, and France with the Allies. So we have a nice mix here. Eventually, nations like Great Britain are going to be pulled in, and not only just the people of the, England or such, anybody who was under the British Crown. So that would mean people that were in India, people that were in Kenya, people in Egypt, and so forth, all could be part of this world war. And in a way, almost every continent, with the exception of maybe Antarctica, had some kind of group of people that were probably fighting in this war at some point in time. And number 8, what was a major problem with Germany's invasion route into France? And part of this is that the alliance system had brought Great Britain into the war. This idea that, if Germany is going to get involved, another ally is going to get involved. And the next thing we know, we have really pretty much almost every nation of Europe, with the exception of a few, that are going to be participating in this event. And number 9, why did many Irish Americans sympathize with Germany and the Central Powers? Well, a lot of this has to do with some issues with the British and the fact that the British were ruling Ireland. Many of them saw the British as tyrants and wanted them to leave, and they thought that if they supported Germany and the Central Powers, certainly that might send a message to the British. At some point in time, shortly after the end of this war, we're going to see the beginning of the nation, or the Republic of Ireland. And the northern part of Ireland is going to be under the British Crown as part of Great Britain. And number 10, how did Great Britain and Germany try to win American support? Well, they used propaganda to influence public opinion. Not only are you going to see this in forms of like newspaper articles, leaflets, but posters and such, all these kind of things, even movies, the simple ones, the silent ones, were all part of this propaganda machine that at some point in time is going to pull the United States in, but it's going to take a little bit of time. And number 11, why was America's prosperity intertwined with the military fortunes of Great Britain, France, and Russia? And part of this had to do with the banking industry. American banks had invested heavily in an Allied victory. They had lended money to the British and the French with the hopes that maybe they would win and maybe that they would gain some financial opportunities that way. And so in a way, you have Americans who are supposedly neutral financially are tied into this war, who are basically saying, maybe we need to get involved. And you're going to have a handful of business people who are going to be calling for that. And number 12, how did Germany respond to a British blockade? The Germans had, basically started using U-boats, which are submarines like you see pictured below here. And they basically deployed these U-boats or subs and announced that they would sink without any warning ships in the waters around Great Britain, especially if there were ships that were flying a British flag. At some point in time, even neutral ships are going to come under fire. And that would play a part in bringing the United States into this war, but that's a later story. And number 13, what did Germany do to keep the United States from breaking off diplomatic relations? And one of the things that they did is they signed what is called the Sussex Pledge. This was a pledge that the Germans, for the most part, would not sink merchant ships without a warning. So if there was supposedly an American ship that might be shipping goods to the Allies, what the Germans would do is that they would surface their sub. They would pretty much warn the captain of that ship, that merchant ship, and would tell them to vacate the ship. And they would give them ample amount of time to leave the ship, and then they would torpedo the ship and sink it. So they're going to warn them before they blow them off the face of the earth. Number 14, what did Germany promise to Mexico in return for Mexico's support in World War I? You got to remember, at this period of time, the United States and Mexico were at war with one another over all the stuff with the government in Mexico kind of being in a state of chaos, and we had the raids by Pancho Villa and his followers. So the German ambassador to Mexico City, a man named Alfred Zimmermann, basically sent a secret message known as the Zimmermann Note, which you see right in front of you. And as you can see, it's a mathematical note. Each one of those numbers represents a letter. Needless to say, the United States had deciphered this secret code that the Germans were using. And we found out that, if Mexico got involved in the war and kept the United States from, basically helping the Allies in Europe, that Mexico would regain some of the land that they lost after the Mexican War in the 1840s. And basically a part of the American Southwest would go back to Mexico. So California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, all that would go back. Okay. And as a result of that, Americans were not too happy. So, number 15, what event finally drew the United States into war? And I will say this up front, that there were probably several events that tie us into the war. Got to remember the Zimmermann Note, this is happening in roughly 1917. But this next one actually kind of happened a little bit before. Germany, for the most part, started resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. And probably the most famous ship that was sunk was the Lusitania. Lusitania was a sister ship of the Titanic. So if that tells you what the luck was here, it wasn't very good. But the Lusitania was carrying basically what I would call contraband, which is basically items that were going to be shipped to the British and the French that were going to help them wage war. Okay, and as a result, there were Americans on board. The German government actually issued a warning in the New York Times to any passenger on the Lusitania that this ship was going to be targeted. So a lot of passengers kind of knew what was going on, but this ship was sunk literally right off the coast of Ireland. In many cases, there were people on the Irish coast that could actually see what had happened. Unlike the Titanic, which took several hours to sink, the Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk literally within 20 minutes. So very few people were able to make it to the lifeboats and to find safety. Thank you very much.